Not going to recommend Middlemarch, even though it's phenomenal and 100% worth a read. Not going to recommend The Fairy Queen, even though it's a very long classic. Is it the longest? It might be the longest thing I've ever read, but honestly, it just was not for me. If some recommendations that aren't those two sound good to you, stay tuned. 2026 is encroaching upon us fast, and one of your resolutions might have to do with what books you're reading next year. At the close of the year, it's a good time to reflect on the cultural assumptions we bring to reading as a habit. I think we can fairly diagnose a trend in society that evaluates a reading habit based on accumulation of quantity over quality. In response, many people have re-emphasized the importance of reading slowly and mindfully, of rereading, etc., to increase depth instead of quantity. But what if there's a way to combine both things? To focus on accomplishment, achieving a specific quantity, and on quality, on a depth that is enriching and nourishing. One way I think that we could all do this in 2026 is by putting a few long books on our TBR. The benefit of a long book is that it accrues experience and time. It follows you through a period of your life, and it becomes like a companion. The spaciousness invites you into a relationship with the text. Of course, smaller books do this too, but some special intimacy grows when you work on a project. And so that's what this video is all about. Classic project books, long classics for your 2026 resolutions. So my first recommendation is actually going to be a selection from Chaucer's writings, specifically Troilus and Cresside. Troilus and Cresside is Chaucer's longest poem, and it's a retelling of a story from Boccaccia, and it's set in the siege of Troy. I really enjoy thinking about the birds in the text, the role of falconry as a way of describing the female love interest, agency, and the constraints on that agency. There's a beautiful love scene, there's tragedy, and there's this deft layering of timelines that points always back to the act of reinterpretation, which makes it a story about storytelling and gives it that extra layer of depth that makes a good read. And also, Shakespeare is said to have looked back to this tale, the one that Chaucer's iterating here, in inspiration of Romeo and Juliet. So if you like that text, this is a good one for you. One other thing I love about the book is the invocation of Boethius at the beginning. If the questions of fate and free will and determinism fascinate you, it's really interesting to see Chaucer play in a fictionalizing way, in a poetic way, with theological perspectives on free will that Boethius presents, and sort of in an ironic way. So that's my first. My next suggestion, Don Quixote. There's so much. It's a super rewarding journey. I don't know if anyone's thought critically about this, but for me, the first time I read it, it gave me the feelings that reading Lord of the Rings did as a child. I think just the scope and the scale is part of that. The two main characters are infinitely compelling, and I also really appreciate the questions of freedom that it raises. I remember thinking deeply about a section which depicts prisoners and criminals in a very interesting way. There's, of course, the iconic scene with the windmills. It's incredibly humorous and impossible to put down. Next, the unraveling of fantasy unmasking. It's great. My next recommendation is going to be Lies and Sorcery by Elsa Morante, and I just love this text. It follows 3 generations of women, and I especially appreciate how the first half is more fantastical and exaggerated, and the second half is a gut-wrenching, devastating realism in response. And the narrator, retelling this family history, slips in and out of omniscience in a really compelling fashion. And also, there's just images in here that are unforgettable. If you like narratives where setting becomes a character, it's a great one. Okay, next is gonna be Proust, In Search of Lost Time. And this is volume 1 that I'm recommending in this video. That's all I've read. I think that if you like contemporary literature, Proust is a touchstone for so many authors, and so the reverberations of this text in the literature that is being produced today are undeniable. I really like some of the analysis of the text done by Jesse McCarthy. Of course, there's Lydia Davis's thoughtful translation and reflections on the translation of the text. The prose just so captivating. Such beautiful sentences. A sort of subtle humor that Stockholms you. It's an intimacy that's just undeniable. This next one is Memoirs of Hadrian, and this is a fictionalization of the life of Emperor Hadrian. It's an epistolary novel, so it's Hadrian writing to Marcus Aurelius, his successor, and Yourcenar's process was all-consuming. She stalked all the sites Hadrian would have visited and touched what he touched. She conceived of the project first in her early young adulthood and revisited it again and again over decades. She chose, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, only French words that had Latin roots to bring her voice as close as possible to his. And it's not necessarily the longest numerically on this list. It's only 347 pages, but the minutia of that detail and world making, the transportation, the scale, it's like a portal into ancient Rome. And I found it slow moving, but ultimately deeply rewarding and entrancing. Okay, so I don't have any of my Tolstoy here with me, I don't think. I believe I've left them in storage somewhere. But of the long Tolstoys, I'm going to recommend War and Peace. I personally connect a little bit more with the characters of Anna Karenina, but also Anna Karenina is something that I've read more than once, whereas War and Peace I've only gotten through once. But nonetheless, I'm suggesting War and Peace because the text jumps through genres, timelines, it reduces relationships to rubble in a moment, it does history making, it philosophizes, it thinks about the nation, it thinks about the family, it thinks about religion. And so just the breadth of the encounter with the world that you get in that text is resolution making, makes it something that is worth turning into a project. Turning into, if you only could read one book in 2026, that would justify it being War and Peace. Moving into some texts that are not fiction, I'm going to recommend Montaigne. You don't have to read the complete essays, but choosing a few and getting started. Montaigne's voice is so striking and modern and intimate, and I think you might be sensing with a lot of my recommendations something that gives you intimacy, that roots you, that cuts close is important when you're taking on a long project. Montaigne's writing is something that you can grow into. His writing is something where you can bring your whole self and leave changed, more reflective, more curious. His writing's on the self and the bounds of the self, and his ability to think through what it means to make a persona on the page. Really great, especially for folks who like thinking about the role of the first person, whether it be in criticism, autofiction, etc. Next recommendation, I actually left my copy at home despite loving it so much. It's The Republic by Plato, and maybe you've read this before, maybe not. I read it around 3 or 4 times, and I find it to be a really rewarding text to revisit. The first time I read it, I completely misread it and sort of took everything Socrates espouses in his thought experiment to be Plato's belief, or, what we should accept wholesale. And the second or third time I read it, I had a professor, a specialist in Rousseau, encourage us to think about whether Socrates, in the thought experiment of imagining this perfectly just city, is pushing his interlocutors to note the dissonance between this abstraction and the bounds of a human, to encourage them to think through the active work of living with wisdom, the active work of philosophizing. And I can never explain it as well as her, but it was an analytic shift that opened the text to me. And so I later revisited the section, especially on poetry, which much has been made about it, where Socrates sort of is condemning art and representation and poetic experimentation. And I noted the contradictions in a new way. It's a dialogue, it's a work of fictionalizing, there's drama, there's setting, there's character. It's a thought experiment, there's some form and representation going on there. And I thought about how fundamental I find the human desire for art to be. And I think obviously this section is saying something meaningful in earnest about the role art plays in in politics and society making. But for me, that funneled me into the more metaphysical parts of the Republic, like the divided line section, the allegory of the cave, and into this question about the active life of wisdom. Philosophy is a way of life. I'm sort of a dopo. More philosophy recommendation is going to be Critique of Pure Reason, this doorstopper. I haven't read it all, but the selections I have read have been incredibly meaningful. And I think approaching literary criticism and thinking through the history of it, you might encounter Cavell, and I think Cavell had a lot of respect and appreciation for Kant, and being able to have dexterity with a sense of the apparatus of perception which we bring to the world, and thinking through these metaphysical questions of like what understanding is and where it occurs and what can be known is honestly just like really challenging but really pleasurable. And I don't think it's a text you necessarily can or should wade through on your own. I had great teachers and great peers help me get through it, but I think there are lots of great resources online for you to dive into it. So those are my initial thoughts.